Welcome, everybody. What a pleasure it is to introduce somebody who needs no introduction whatsoever. Great Women is so happy that Rabbi Elton is going to speak to us this evening. His topic is a most interesting one. Why can't women be Orthodox rabbis, or can they? So without any further ado, oh, just one thing, there is a further ado. If you have any questions, if you could type them into the chat box, and then we'll get to them when Rabbi has finished talking, and then of course you'll also have the opportunity to ask your questions live. Rabbi Elton, please go ahead. We're thrilled to have you with us.
Thank you very much indeed, and it's such a pleasure to see everyone's faces and even see everyone's names and know they're here. It's just so nice to be able to connect virtually, even though it's difficult to connect in person at the moment. Although for those who feel able to do so in terms of their level of vulnerability, we're back open for 50 people at every service, so please God, more of us will actually be in shul over the coming weeks and months, and we return to some sort of normality. Well, this is a very topical issue for us here in Sydney, because as you probably saw in the AJN, a couple of weeks ago, Judith Levitan received her smicha. She received her rabbinical ordination from Yeshivat Maharat in New York. Maharat stands for Madricha Halaktit, Ruchanit, Tornit, a legal, spiritual, and Torah leader. She underwent 3 years of study using the technology we're using now, Zoom and other similar technologies, to study the same course in rabbinics as I studied. The same topics are covered, and she was examined and she passed and was given her rabbinic ordination. She's not the first. We'll go into the history of women's ordination in the different religious movements in a little while, but it's certainly very controversial. The Orthodox Union, which is the major modern Orthodox rabbinical association, synagogue association really, in the United States, came out with a very powerful statement against women rabbis. They are inadmissible and inappropriate, and they can't serve, in fact, in Orthodox Union synagogues under that title. They can be called community educator, or they can be called educator, community leader, whatever they want, but they can't be called rabbi, anything like rabbi. Now, Judith Levitan has called herself rabbinit, which is a funny word in some ways, because it's the Hebrew for rebbitzin. So, whereas in the diaspora, the rabbi's wife is often called the rebbitzin, a Yiddish word, of course, in Israel, she has often been called the rabbinit. But rabbinit has actually taken on in the last 20 or 30 years a different sort of connotation, because really women like Rabbinit Henkin or Rabbinit Taragin, who gave a course on Ruth before Shavuot, although these women happen to be married to rabbis, and that's how they sort of technically got the title Rabbinit, the truth is in practice they're using the term, the name Rabbinit, the title Rabbinit, as a reflection of their own status. Although it came from their husbands, actually, when we say Rabbinit Henkin, Rabbinit Taragin, we're giving them a title. And it's sort of an excuse, they're married to the rabbi. The point is, they themselves, we feel, are worthy of that title. So, a lot of resistance. We'll see why there's resistance shortly, but also an increasing number of women are receiving this rabbinic ordination. Before we go any further, I should define what smicha is. What is rabbinic ordination? Well, smicha means to rest upon, because in the time of Moses and onwards, a teacher would lay his hands on the student and would transmit to that student smicha, status as a rabbi, status as an authoritative teacher in Israel. So Moses gave smicha to Joshua, and Joshua to his disciples, and this carried on all the way until the Talmudic period. And the term rabbi, the word rabbi, indicated that somebody was had smicha, as it still does. rabbi or rav indicated somebody had smicha, as it still does. There was a disruption, obviously, in the Talmudic period, which caused all sorts of different developments in Judaism. And one of those was that smicha disappeared. Authentic smicha disappeared. No one has access to that chain going back to Moses anymore. And whereas the original smicha, genuine smicha, actually invested the person in the right to give a ruling which was binding, and a Beth Din, for example, made up of 3 people with smicha, is absolutely authoritative and cannot be argued with. That's not true of people with smicha today. Smicha today is hatarat hora'ah. It is permission to give a rabbinic ruling. Why do you need permission? Because there is a principle that one should not give a ruling in the lifetime of one's teacher. That if someone's taught you and they're still alive, it is presumptuous for you to teach anybody else. Teach in the sense of tell them what the halacha, tell them what Jewish law is. That's inappropriate, unless they have explicitly given you permission to do so. And that's exactly what smicha is. Smicha is hatarat hora'ah, permission to teach or to give halachic rulings. One's teacher says, this person who I've taught is now learned enough that I trust them to go and teach and give rulings on their own, and I don't mind them doing so even in my lifetime. So what we're talking about is not smicha in the original sense. It's an attestation that somebody has reached a certain level of knowledge and skill in dealing with traditional texts and looking at issues in the light of those texts, and is competent to tell you what the Jewish position ought to be on a range of matters. And therefore, on the surface, there should be no reason why women can't do that. Having smicha is a sort of degree, really. It's just a testament to somebody's competence in particular areas. So looked at it in that way, there shouldn't be a problem. What problems there are, we will come across a little later on. Having established what smicha is, let me give you some of the prehistory of smicha, the prehistory of women's ordination. Not in the modern period, but going back to the Bible. So although most of the leaders of the Jewish people over the centuries were men, and we could name dozens of them, there always were, every now and again, women leaders who rose to prominence. Deborah, for example. Deborah the Judge, who, along with Barak, who was her general, ruled the Jewish people and was a very successful leader of the Jewish people in the land of Israel in her time. And she's called a judge. Now, a judge in the biblical period doesn't mean somebody who adjudicates law cases like a judge today. It means somebody who would do that, but also was a general leader, a political leader of the people. Not quite with the powers or authority of the king, but not far off. So she was a political and legal leader of the people. And of course, in those days, there only was Torah law. So we shall look in a minute about how it was possible that Deborah, a woman, could be a judge if women are not allowed to make halachic rulings, because otherwise, how was she doing her job? There are also 7 prophetesses in the period, in the biblical period. They don't decide law, but they are very much leaders of the people. There's Queen Esther, of course, who, along with Mordechai, set up the rules for Purim. It says explicitly in the Megillah, in the book of Esther, that Queen Esther and Mordechai together wrote the Megillah and determined how Purim ought to be celebrated. So she was clearly a woman of authority. There was Queen Shlomtzion, who was one of the Hasmonean queens and was more worthy of the throne than the men who were around it in her period. And there was also Bruria, the wife of Rabbi Meir. Looking into the Talmudic period, Bruria was an extremely learned woman, married to Rabbi Meir, one of the great sages of his generation, and was identified as standing on equal footing with many of the rabbis who were active in her lifetime. So if we look at the biblical period and the Talmudic period, we do see a lot of significant female leaders, not as many as there were men, but nevertheless they very much do exist. If you look maybe at the more modern period, early modern period, there was a rabbi called Rabbi Yoshua Falk, who was active in the late 16th century, and he had a wife called Bela. And Bela, Marat Bela, was a very significant scholar in her own right. And in fact, one of her rulings or opinions has come down to posterity. As we know, when we light candles on a Friday night, usually women do so, because you can't do anything with fire on Shabbat, you can't even light one flame from another flame. First of all, the person lighting will light the candle and then put the match out or drop the match, not make the bracha yet, because once they make the bracha, maybe they brought in Shabbat. So they light the candle, drop the match, and then they cover their eyes, make the bracha, and then they open their eyes so that they are only benefiting from the light after they've made the bracha. That's where we do things on Friday night, because once it's Shabbat, you couldn't light the candle. That's not true on Yom Tov. On Yom Tov, you can't strike a match, but you can transfer flame from one source to another. So what Marat Bela said is that on Yom Tov, you should strike the match, make the bracha, and then light the candles, and then put the match down. You can't extinguish it, you can't ignite it, but you can transfer. And therefore, the normal order of making a bracha and then doing a mitzvah should be restored. Every other time we make a bracha before we do the mitzvah, you make the bracha, then you shake the lulav. You make the bracha, then you light the Hanukkah candles. She said, I can understand why Shabbat is different. There's no reason Yom Tov should be different. And that was her opinion. And not everyone agreed, but everyone debated it. Everyone took it seriously. And in fact, the Mishnah Brura, which is probably the most authoritative guide to Jewish law of our generation, written until the 1930s, finished in the 1930s, seems to rule according to the opinion of Marat Bela. So there's a halachic ruling coming from a woman in the last 500 years, which has become pretty authoritative. There was a few, at least two Rebbes, Hasidic Rebbes who were women. The Maid of Ludmir, for example, was a female Rebbe in the 19th century in Poland. If we go all the way from Europe to the Middle East, in Mosul, Osnat was a Rosh Yeshiva. She was the daughter of the previous Rosh Yeshiva. Already during his lifetime, she was giving lectures, shiurim, to the bochrim, to the students in the yeshiva. And when her father died, she succeeded as the Rosh Yeshiva. And she was known as Moratenu, not Morenu, our male teacher, but Moratenu, our female teacher. And she was elevated to that level of a Rosh Yeshiva, and notwithstanding that she was a woman. Or a final example is Chava Bakarak, who was a very learned woman, very pious woman, who was learned in all areas of Torah and would engage in intellectual back and forth with the students and rabbis of her day on a par with them. So, from the 16th century to the 19th century, we have these prominent women leaders. And of course, in the 20th century, we have Sarah Schneier, who founds the Beth Jacob movement of female education. So she didn't claim to be a rabbi, but she was certainly a very prominent figure in the Jewish world and a significant leader in Orthodoxy. That's the background. We have a tradition of rare, but definitely present, female religious leadership and female halachic and other Torah expertise. What about ordination? What about actually declaring that these women are rabbis? Well, it began in the Reform movement, as one would expect. Regina Jonas was ordained a rabbi in Germany in 1935, ends up dying in Auschwitz. Lily Montagu in England was not actually ordained, but she was what might be called a lay preacher. And she took on the role of preacher and clergy in the liberal Jewish synagogue in London, which was the most progressive form of Judaism in London at that time. In the Reform movement in America, there was a woman ordained, Sally Priesand was ordained in 1972. In 1985, Amy Eyal Berg was ordained as the first conservative female rabbi. And in 1999, something very interesting happened in Orthodoxy. The first Yoetzet Halacha was given her credentials. What is a Yoetzet Halacha? It means literally a halachic advisor. And that term was chosen very, very carefully. Not a halachic authority or a halachic decider, but a halachic advisor, a much more gentle term. Rabbi Yehuda Herzl Henkin and his wife, Rabbinate Henkin, were very keen to advance the cause of women's education. And in particular, they saw the need to have learned women, properly educated and learned women, who would give advice on family purity matters, the laws arising from menstruation and going to the mikveh and so on, where many women would not be comfortable going to a rabbi, a male rabbi. They would want to go to a woman. And so they trained women from 1999 onwards in these laws and gave them certification that they were competent to be halachic advisors. Now, the Henkins are nothing if not smart, because they, in 1999 and ever since, they have couched what they are doing in very non-threatening terms. They're not rabbis, they're not decisors, they're not authorities, they're advisors, and we're just making sure they're good advisors. And if they come across something that's too difficult for them to handle, don't worry, they'll go to a rabbi and talk about it. So in some senses that's true, because we all do that, except the very top people in the world. We all have issues above our pay grade. We go to other rabbis to seek their advice. But the truth is that when a woman goes to a Yetzet Halacha and asks for guidance, she asks for it and she gets it, unless the woman doesn't know. The Yetzet doesn't know, just as one would with any rabbi. So in my mind, a Yetzet Halacha is a female rabbi for all intents and purposes, but because it's been handled in a very politically savvy way, it's received mostly received acceptance in modern Orthodoxy. There are definitely people in modern Orthodoxy opposed to Yoatzot Halacha and in more right-wing Orthodoxy, but for the most part, they have received tremendous acceptance. And I think it's a lesson about how you get things done. Somewhat differently, 10 years later in 2009, Rabbi Sarah Horowitz was ordained by Rabbi Avi Weiss, who also signed my ordination document. And he was much more forthright about it. He created the acronym Maharat. He was specifically talking about leadership, halachic, spiritual and Torah leadership. And then she took the title Rabbah as a form of title, a female form of rabbi. And this caused huge ructions and really started a controversy, which is still going over 10 years later. But Sarah Horowitz is, I think, considered the first female Orthodox rabbi, give or take. In 2015, Lila Cadogan took the title rabbi. She was the first Orthodox woman to call herself rabbi, not Maharat, not Rabbah, not Rabbinit, not Maratenu, but rabbi. And I think there have been some female ordained people who since then have also taken the title rabbi. So the process in Orthodoxy is in a sense complete. There are those who identify as Orthodox Jews and are women and are called rabbi. So it seems there are Orthodox rabbis in practice, facts on the ground. But as I say, the Orthodox Union, which is not an extreme organization, has set its face very firmly against the institution. So why can't a woman be a rabbi? What are the objections to a woman being a rabbi? So I think there are three. The first is that a woman can't make up a minyan or lead services in Orthodoxy. Only men over the age of 13 can count towards a minyan, and only a man can discharge the duty of leading the congregation in prayer, saying things like Kaddish, leading Kedusha, repeating the Amidah, saying Baruch Hu. The most important aspects of a communal service, in Orthodoxy, it's pretty uncontested that any man can do that. A woman can't. So therefore, how can a woman be a rabbi? Second objection, a woman can't be an aide. A woman can't be a witness. So for example, at a wedding, when I perform a wedding, I am one of the two witnesses to that wedding, and the other rabbi is almost invariably the second witness, but a woman can't be a witness. So she can't perform that function. She can't run a wedding without a religious man, or two in fact, being there. And there is a Gemara in Nida. The Talmud says in Tractate Nida that somebody who cannot be a witness cannot judge. So if you can't be a witness, you can't be a judge. As women can't be witnesses, therefore they can't be judges. They can't sit on the Beth Din. But they can't sit on the Beth Din and give halakhic rulings. How can they be a rabbi, even in the sense of giving halakhic rulings? Okay. there are the objections. Now let's look at some of the answers to those specific objections. Well, first of all, there is no necessary connection between being part of the minyan and leading services and being a rabbi. In my shul in England, in Manchester, the rabbi did exactly two things on a Shabbos morning. He said the prayers for the state of Israel and for the royal family, and he gave the sermon. He didn't lead any part of the service whatsoever. And in many traditional shuls, there's a chazan. And in Orthodox shuls, I mean very observant shuls, balabatim, members of the congregation, lead the service. They don't need the rabbi. The rabbi is there to give the sermon and answer questions and guide people if something comes up that's problematic. But he doesn't take any role in leading the service. And if he's number 11, he's not necessarily for the minyan either. So there's no need really to connect being a rabbi with performing those ritual roles. Same is true of edut, of being a witness. So, a woman can be the rabbi in the sense, at a wedding, in the sense of she can address the couple, she can prepare the couple and counsel the couple. And when it comes to witnessing, she'll call two men forward to act as witnesses. There's no reason she shouldn't be a rabbi in the sense of preaching, teaching, and offering pastoral guidance, which is what essentially 90% of the rabbinate is. We'll look at the third objection in detail now. Now, these objections, of course, raise big questions about Deborah, who we met early on in this talk. Deborah the Judge, how could she do so if there are all these objections, particularly the idea that a woman who can't be a witness can't be a judge? How could therefore Deborah be a judge? And this is addressed by Tosafot. Tosafot is the generation of the grandchildren of Rashi. And one of the funny things about Rashi is he had no sons, he only had daughters. And so his daughters were not public rabbinic figures, but their sons were. But they were private scholarly figures. The Tosafot quote their mothers and their aunts, and their halachic opinions and their opinions in questions of the Talmud or the Torah itself. They were clearly very learned women, the daughters of Rashi. And one of the daughters of Rashi, in fact, was Rashi's amanuensis at the end of his life, when he was, I think, blind possibly, or certainly too frail to write. He would dictate and she would write. So to be able to perform that function, you have to be pretty advanced in your own scholarship. So Tosafot have not a vested interest exactly, but they have a sympathy towards women of learning. They see such things as a possibility because that was the atmosphere in which they were raised. Rashi taught his daughters, and his daughters, their mothers and aunts, knew stuff. So they in fact, Tosafot is a group of people, so they often give different answers, different places. There are in fact three answers in Tosafot give to the question of how Deborah could be a judge. The first is that men and women just have equal status. When it comes to being a judge or being a rabbi, women and men have equal status. But it says those who can't be witnesses can't be judges. So that refers to men. A man who can't be a witness can't be a judge. What sort of man can't be a witness? Well, pigeon fanciers for a start, because they're involved in gambling, in racing for money, gambling on pigeon races, or those who get involved in dice playing, or people who lend money at interest, or those who deal in the product of the sabbatical year when you can't trade in such produce. Those people can't be witnesses. They're disqualified as witnesses. And this Gemara, according to Tosafot in one place, means that the same people can't also be judges. But it's not about women at all. He's talking about men who are disqualified from being witnesses. A second answer is that judges and halachic rulings are not the same thing at all. When a bet din, a properly constituted bet din, sits, its ruling is binding as a matter of procedure and process. So you and I go into bet din and we say to the bet din, right, we give you the right to arbitrate or decide our case. And they could be right or wrong, But once we have gone through that technical process saying, we will both accept whatever answer you give us, it's binding upon us. That's the way courts work. When they're properly constituted and they come go through the proper process and procedures, their answer is binding. There's no point saying to the High Court in Australia, you're wrong. They might be wrong, but the High Court, and therefore what they say goes. But halachic rulings are different. Halachic rulings are not because of a technical composition of a court. It's because you know your stuff, because it's accurate, it's right. An inaccurate halachic ruling isn't binding on anybody. So therefore, even though a woman might not be able to be a judge, that doesn't mean she can't give halachic rulings, because they're a totally different kettle of fish. Another answer: Deborah didn't actually give rulings. She taught, but with the understanding that when somebody who knows what they're talking about teaches, you listen to them. So quite apart from whether it was technically binding or not, that's kind of irrelevant. She taught, and people had the good sense to do what she advised. And that's true of rabbis today, actually. No one is forced to take my halachic advice on anything. But if they want to know something and I give them an answer, hopefully I'm right and hopefully they'll listen to me. And a fourth answer is that the Jewish people accepted her as their judge. That anything is possible if it's with communal acceptance. So you can choose to accept a woman or a man, it doesn't matter. Communal acceptance of that person as an individual trumps all other considerations. So that is Tosafot's series of answers, which would seem to get around all the problems of female rabbis. Doesn't change anything about whether they're going to be part of a minyan or lead the service or be witnesses under the chuppah, but they can be rabbis in the sense of what rabbis actually do day to day. By the way, just in parentheses, this question about women not being able to lead a service is why there was widespread opposition in the conservative movement in the early 80s to women's ordination, because in the conservative movement, really only the clergy would run services. It was almost synonymous with being a rabbi or a chazan, was to, obviously the chazan, but even with the rabbi, to run the service. And it was thought that the one thing would lead to another, that women would start off being rabbis and end up being full participants in the ritual, which of course has happened in the conservative movement, which is now essentially egalitarian. There are other objections which have been raised to female rabbis. It says in the Torah that you should appoint yourself a king, make yourself a melech, and the Rambam says melech velo malka. It says you appoint a king, you don't appoint a queen. This is an innovative idea by the Rambam. It's a novel idea by the Rambam. Other people say they don't really know where he gets it from. But he takes it to mean that women cannot have positions of authority. They cannot take that public role. Of course, the Rambam was active in Muslim environment where women were very much kept inside. That's his milieu. And that's why, since then, many people have not regarded this Rambam as authoritative. And in any case, it might be trumped, even according to the Rambam, if there's public acceptance. A woman can't be the queen unless people accept her as such. There's an objection made in terms of sniut, that it's not modest or appropriate for a woman to take on the role of a rabbi. Well, the answer to that is it depends on the woman and how she conducts herself. And also in a world where you have female CEOs and prime ministers and what have you, not being a woman rabbi because of its immodest would seem to be rather out of kilter with that. There's an objection that it's a reform innovation and one shouldn't import into orthodoxy a reform innovation. There is certainly a disinclination to adopt reform practices, but they do creep in. Bat mitzvah, for example, started in reform and got into orthodoxy. It can be reformulated in a way that is appropriate in an orthodox context. And the fourth objection, which I think is the most pressing one, most active one, is that it's radical, it's threatening, and it gives people the heebie-jeebies. That I think is the most the most fundamental reason why people object to it. And my answer, and I think this sort of reflects my whole approach to Jewish law and its development, is that these things have to be done in an evolutionary and a sensitive way, and done with a certain amount of gentleness, which I think Rabbi Weiss lacks, but Rabbinate Henkin have in greater quantity. And those who are, of course, impatient and just want to do what's right as soon as possible will be frustrated by that, by this evolutionary approach. But I think it gets results. As I say, Yoatzot Halacha are rabbis as far as I'm concerned, and they're tremendously accepted. And there are also female clergy working who just have decided not to use the title for political reasons. So when I was working at Lincoln Square Synagogue, there was a community educator, Dr. Ilana Steinhain, and a community intern, Ilona Gadish, who's also a Yotzet Halacha. And they were on the clergy page of the synagogue website, and they gave sermons, and they gave classes, and they gave pastoral advice, and they gave halachic advice and guidance. They were female rabbis as well, but they didn't use the term, and so they were more accepted. So the question I was posed was, why can't women be Orthodox rabbis, or can they? The truth is they can, in as much as they can and they should be educated in all the areas of law that a man can be educated in. They can become competent in those areas, and they can fulfill all the duties of a modern rabbi to preach, to teach, and to provide pastoral guidance and support. So for once, you get a straight answer to a rabbinic question. And I'm now happy to take questions or comments.
Okay, so if you have any questions for Rabbi, if you could raise your hand, and then we'll unmute yourself. Lauren will unmute you. Rabbi, I have a question. Are there any Orthodox congregations, well, I'm thinking about the USA, but really anywhere in the world, who have appointed a halachic advisor, rabbi, as their sole spiritual leader?
I don't think appointed. There's a woman called Dasi Fruchter, and she's founded her own synagogue. So she's founded a small sort of grassroots congregation of her own. And she's the sole spiritual leader there. There was also a synagogue, a congregation called KOE, Kehilat Orche Eliezer, and they had a female leader for a period. But I think that synagogue is now sort of closed down. But it also had a female leader for a short period.
Yes, Rabbi, I'd like to mention something personal. Because we're members back in the United States, just outside of Washington, D.C., in the state of Maryland. And we have locally several Orthodox synagogues of different types, a Young Israel and an Orthodox Union, OU synagogue, and we're members of both of those synagogues. In the Orthodox Union synagogue, which is KMS, or Kemp Mill Synagogue, which is quite a wonderful synagogue. They have a Yoetzet Halacha, just as you have mentioned, and they do have separate female minyanim, like for Mincha on Shabbat, and they can even have a bat mitzvah, where the bat mitzvah reads the Kriyat HaTorah, but it will be separate from the normal larger synagogue minyan. Of course, that synagogue is large enough that they have several minyanim throughout the morning. And what they do in the main minyan, they do have women and quite wonderful, learned people that will give Divrei Torah, and the way that they do it, and the bat mitzvah will speak as well. And the way that the synagogue handles it is by ending the service completely, singing Adon Olam, and then they will introduce the speaker, and the speaker will stand exactly at the same podium where the rabbi would give his Devar Torah or Drasha.
So yes, so I think that's a very good model. In the great, when Rabbi Apple introduced the Bat Mitzvah on a Shabbos morning, she speaks, and she still does, just before Adon Olam. To me, the service ends with the last Kaddish after either Aleinu or Shir Shor Yom, the Psalm of the Day, or Anim Zmirot. That's it, and then Adon Olam is a sort of just a bit of fun at the end, because really it belongs at the beginning of Adon Olam. So we have that slot before Adon Olam is when we have women speak at the street.
And they even, in that particular synagogue, they will ask for the men to remove their talit.
Oh, right. I think that's very sensible politically. They don't want to get into trouble with anybody. So they say, oh, no, the service is over. And it gets them what they want. They manage to empower women to speak, and they listen to women, and they learn from women. And they have to, make sure they tread cannily in political terms, and good luck to them.
Yes. Yeah, and Dasi Fruchter comes from Arkila, from our neighborhood.
Yes, I know her father.
Yes.
I know her.
Yeah, Chaim Fruchter, yeah. That's right.
Anybody else have any comments? Or Benjamin, did you want to?
Yes, just a quick one, Rabbi. Have you mentioned when you talked about women not being able to be witnesses to a number of things? So I understand that this has changed a lot, and that women now are able to do or to become witnesses in a lot of halakhic and bet din type of things. But do you know of any of the time where women are still no longer able to be witnesses?
Well, you're right, as it happens. There are actually certain areas of law where they can be witnesses. For example, if you want to free an aguna, if you want to free a woman whose husband disappeared, let's not say that he's refusing to give her the divorce. He's disappeared. Well, if she's seen his dead body and she comes to the bet din, she says, I've seen the dead body, we accept that testimony. So in fact, it's not a universal bar on women being witnesses. But for most things we deal with most of the time, like being witness to a wedding or a divorce, women are barred in those cases.
Why though? Why is it?
Oh, why?
Yeah.
Why women? So that is just that's just black letter law. That women can't be witnesses in almost all cases. That's just accepted as a fact on the ground.
But you understand why you then understand why some people will look at us as Orthodox Jews and say, well, we discriminate against women.
Yeah, so I think, yes, and that's true, and we do. And, yeah. I think
that's not necessarily a good thing.
I think any honest assessment of orthodoxy would say that it's not egalitarian. Egalitarianism is not actually a value of orthodoxy, interestingly enough. It's a modern value, it's a contemporary value, it's not an orthodox value. So I'll give you a few examples before I get to women. We have Cohen, Levi, and Israel. Then they're not all equal in all sorts of ways. The Cohen always gets the first aliyah. The Cohen has the right to lead the grace after meals. The Cohen actually has the right to our certain amount of deference and respect in their presence. So that there isn't that. The firstborn isn't equal to his siblings. He gets a greater portion of the inheritance than his siblings do. So the Torah's greatest interest is not actually egalitarianism. It's a functioning society, and it's definitely true that women are either relieved from, or in some cases not allowed to take part in certain public functions. Witness is one of those where they just disbarred, but even other commandments they can choose to take on, but they don't have to, because the Torah is built around the way most people live their lives. Most people have, two parents and a number of children. That's the way most families grow. And it's also the way of the world that in most cases, and not all cases, the woman takes the greater childcaring role than the man, especially in the early years. And the Torah is designed. The Torah is designed in such a way, and the way it grows rabbinically in such a way, that women are not obliged to take part in all the public areas of religious functioning, like going to minyan 3 times a day, like performing all the other mitzvot which have to be done in a certain time, because they are given the space not to have these regulated time-bound obligations. Now, when their life becomes such they can choose to take them on, they come to shul as much as they like. They can come to shul 3 times a day, but they just don't have the obligation to do so. Only men are obligated, and women have the option to do so. But there's also a rule that those who aren't obligated can't discharge the obligation of others. So therefore only men can discharge the obligation. That's a sort of knock-on effect of the Torah not saying we're going to treat everyone equally, but we're going to try and arrange religious life the way most people would need it to function, and to expect all women at all stages of their lives to be in shul at 7 in the morning and 7 in the evening just wouldn't be practical or realistic. So I mean that's something I think is a fair sort of interpretation of why the laws developed as they did. But as I say, the prior point to that is this: that if we try and assert that orthodoxy is actually egalitarian, we can have a very tough time. All of these discussions begin with an appreciation that orthodoxy isn't egalitarian. It has other values, different values. But the problem has been that there have been bars and hurdles which aren't there necessarily, which are there societally, sociologically, culturally, historically, and those should be removed. Just because something hasn't been done doesn't mean that if it can be done, I'll start again. Things which have not been done but are perfectly permitted, there's no reason why we shouldn't permit them and indeed encourage them. That won't touch all areas, but it'll touch many more areas than was the case 100 years ago or 200 years ago.
Thank you.
Rabbi, we have a question from Karen Pryor, and she asks, why can't a woman say amen to a man's Kaddish?
No, she certainly can. Certainly can.
Yeah.
And a man can say amen to a woman's Kaddish, for that matter.
Anybody else have a question? I have a question. When we were living in the United States, I asked if I could become a mohel, and I was told no, because I was not obliged to have a circumcision myself. I could not. Can you elaborate on that a little?
Yes, it's a dispute whether a woman could be a mohelet. It's definitely a matter of dispute. And I think we'd say that if you were given a bris by a woman, you wouldn't have to do anything afterwards. If you're given a bris by, a non-Jewish doctor, for example, which sometimes happens, then you'd have to have some sort of procedure afterwards done by a Jew to make it work. But I think we would all say that if a Jewish woman did it, it works after the fact. The question is whether it's an ideal. And as you say, it's because how can you, as somebody who's not obliged themselves in circumcision, perform the circumcision for another person?
Yeah.
Sorry, are we unmuted?
Jane, yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh, Rabbi, I just wanted to know the name of the female rabbi in 2015.
Lila Cadogan.
How do you say Cadogan?
K-A.
Yeah.
G-E-D-A-N. Cadogan. K-A. No.
K-A-K.
K-A-G-E-D-A-N. Cadogan.
And her first name?
Lila, L-I-L-A.
Right. Thank you. I'm just taking notes for Ellie.
Right. Good.
Did she tell you to excuse her tonight?
I received no apologies from your daughter, I'm afraid.
Awfully rude. She has a Limud meeting tonight. because you know
We're
Limud's on.
all delighted to learn that, Jane.
Well, Limud's on. Well, she's desperate to hear your comments about female rabbis since she's desperate to be one.
Well, this is being recorded, Jane, so she will be able to. Yes, it has been recorded, and
Thank you.
Ellie will be able to watch it.
Have you all rabbis speaking at Limud? Have you registered?
I'm speaking. Yes, I'm speaking.
Yeah. Have you, Sharon and
We will.
Steve?
We will.
Have you registered? It starts this weekend.
Okay, right.
Sorry, can I?
Rabbi, I have another question about the process for obtaining smicha. What happens? Is there a written exam? Are there oral exams? Are there multiple choice exams? What? You know, it seems like it's something that goes on behind closed doors that the rest of us don't know about.
Yes. Is pork a good idea? B, only in private? Or B, totally unacceptable? It depends on the institution. So some places one has an oral test. Some places you have a written test. Sometimes it's open. My test was open book, closed notes. So you could bring in your Shulchan Aruch, you could bring in your text, but not the notes you'd made during the course. At Yeshiva University, you could bring nothing in. You walk in with just a pen and a smile, and that's all you get. And then you answer the questions. And then some places it's just they have you in for a grilling. I have other smichas, of course. So I have my smicha from Chovei Torah, but I also have two smichas otherwise, Rav Bigman and Rabbi Rappaport, and they were both oral.
I just wanted.
Vivian Selwyn has a question.
Sorry, can I just ask a question? Rabbi Elton, you've been talking about a trend that is coming from the United States. In Australia, we still sit under the chief rabbi out of the UK. Would you say that the UK is less willing to consider the idea of women having a larger role than potentially the United States, and that we in Australia are sort of having to try and work within that as well?
Britain is certainly a long way behind America. Extraordinary things are going on in Britain. A rabbi I know, who I rather like actually, there's a woman who has smicha in his congregation. He won't let her teach, not with the title, not without the title, because it would send a signal that he's somehow endorsing the idea that women can be rabbis. So, that's, very problematic, I think. She knows lots of stuff. She can give a very nice class, but he won't let her even speak because he will let other women speak. He's not against women speaking, but a woman with the smicha, he won't let speak because it would send the wrong signal. But then England is also a place where a woman can't, carry the Sefer Torah on the Shabbos. So England's a long way behind. Thankfully, in Australia, we are a long way from the politics. We have our own politics here, Kena Hara. We're a long way from all that politics. So, for example, the Sydney Beth Din has been very supportive of Rabbinate Levison, and they made a sort of funny statement that while ordination for women is controversial or whatever, but we know she'll make a great contribution to the community, and we congratulate her on her achievement. So, pretty much endorsing what's happened, because Rabbi Gutnick and Rabbi Ullman, Rabbi Shriki, they're independent characters. They're a long way from everybody else, and if they think something is right and appropriate, they'll say so, and they don't mind. So the 14,000 miles can be very useful sometimes.
I wanted to comment that the title rabbi, as we know it and is appropriate to us, is Rav Hora'ah, somebody who does teach and paskin shailas, to answer questions. But there is in our day another version of Rav, and that's really Hanhaga, or as a manhig. And so the title, as I'm sure you know, is broadened and applied, for instance, in certain institutions, and certainly in Chabad. We know of those who are given the title rabbi, but they are not they're Rav Manhig, but not a Rav Hora'ah.
Yeah.
And the rabbis within their organization know who to really listen to. But the congregation doesn't necessarily know that the rabbi doesn't have a full smicha.
Yeah, and if I'm going to be a bit blunt, smicha has been somewhat devalued in that sense. In the old days, you got smicha when you knew all sections of the Shulchan Aruch, all 4 sections. You knew daily life, you knew laws of kashrut and family purity, you knew questions of personal status, marriage, divorce, conversion, and you knew Choshen Mishpat, you knew civil law as well. And you were given Rai Porush, who got his smicha from the Hildesheimer Seminary in Berlin. He had Yora Yadin Yadin. He could teach and he could be a dayan on a bet din. I have Yora. I don't have the qualification to be a dayan, because now it's very common not to have that. It's just Yora, not Yadin Yadin. And some people don't even have Yora. They just call him rabbi because he's going to give sermons and be a spiritual leader. But you're right, people don't know who's got what on the outside. People on the inside know, but people on the outside don't. So you don't really know what is implied by the term rabbi, in all cases.
Yes, to us who have really studied in yeshiva for many years, it only takes about 15 minutes to listen to another rabbi and know that they're really not.
That's right, firing on all cylinders.
That's right.
Any other?
Was there a question in the question box? I only saw half of it.
Anne has asked, could you please advise the differences between Rebbe, Rabbi, Rav, and other rabbinical titles?
Sure. So Rabbi is the standard diaspora title. Rav became more popular in Israel. And so that's just a split of that sort. So Zionists, even in the diaspora, often known as Rav. So for example, Rabbi Solomon at Mizrahi is known as Rav Shua. Whereas I'm known as Rabbi Elton because I'm at the Great Synagogue. Rebbe has 2 connotations. Rebbe is what you call your teacher in yeshiva or in cheder for that matter. So you will say, he was my Rebbe or my Rebbe in halacha or in Gemara. But also Rebbe in a Hasidic sense means the tzaddik, the righteous special person at the top of the Hasidic tree in your particular branch of Hasidut, who will, be maybe a wonder worker who has a special connection to God, which they can access through you, who will tell you every aspect of your life, how to live it. A rabbi will answer your questions you ask him. Is it kosher or not? A rebbe will tell you, take this job or live in this house or paint your front room purple, often with mystical insights. So, and being a rebbe actually doesn't mean you have smicha, because it's a much more mystical concept than that. It's about access to the divine, not knowing what to do when your meat spoon falls in your milk pot.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions? Wow, well, that was wonderful, Rabbi Elton. Thank you. So enlightening, most fascinating topic. I have one last question for you. Do you see a woman rabbi 50 years, 100 years down the road at the Great Synagogue in Sydney?
So I wouldn't rule it out, because we've been pretty much at the cutting edge for a long time. So confirmations for women, for girls, parallel to bar mitzvah, were begun in the 19th century. They was renamed as bat mitzvah under Eyal Berg, I think. Then the single girl on a single Shabbat was introduced by Rabbi Apple. He also introduced women carrying the Sefer Torah around. He was the rabbinic advisor to the Women's Tefillah group, a role which actually I now have. All my predecessors and myself have hosted Women's Tefillah groups in the Great Synagogue. We introduced the prayer for the congregation read by women most recently. We've had women speakers on a Shabbos morning from the pulpit. So if anywhere in Sydney is likely to have a woman rabbi on its staff, or even as the senior minister in the next 50 years, I think it's likely to be us.
I think, can I add something to what you said, and that you have had a woman recite the Haftarah on her bat mitzvah?
That's right, absolutely.
My granddaughter, for those of you.
And my approach is always to respond to what people would find meaningful and ask for because they find it meaningful. I mean, I always want to give people the benefit of the doubt. There's a bit of a tendency to say, well, they're asking for these things for non-ideal reasons. I choose not to go down that route because I don't think it should be more true of women than of men. But if it's possible to accommodate something and therefore introduce something or enable something which is religiously meaningful, I think that should be done whenever possible. And that's how a lot of these things came about. Yeah. People came and said, we'd like to do X, we'd like to do Y. And so we try and find a way to make it work.
Well, and I have to say, on a personal note, Rabbi Elton has been so supportive when I suggested Kaddish classes for women. He immediately said yes, and we have had the most successful 2 series of Kaddish classes. We were about to start a 3rd series, and coronavirus struck. But as soon as things improve, we'll start that again, and that is another example of how Rabbi Elton is supportive of women and their role in the synagogue. So,
Thank you very much.
I'm just trying to see there. We have lots of lovely thanks from everybody in the chat group. Thank you all for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at more of the Great Women series. Rabbi Elton, once again, thank you so much. And
thank you for having me. It's nice to engage with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.